my pleasure to introduce. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to all these various events. I think this is one of the most special ones. He's an esteemed Gary Leahy, bowmaker. Throughout the world, you'll hear his name. I mean, I think you've got a waiting list the length of, 5 years?
Might be a bit less, but
This is very much in demand, and I can see why. I had a bow when I was playing of Gary's, and I played it frequently along with my old French bow, and I'm sure you'll talk about the differences and how you model your bows on French old 19th century bows as well. But it's such an important aspect of the playing. You have your instrument, but this is the bow. I didn't get an old French bow until I was well into my career, and it was a great addition. But you know more about those than I do.
not necessarily.
No, you do. I just played them.
Well, I'd love to be able to play them like you can. Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. You're all very welcome. Great to have you here. I'll talk a little bit about the history of bows and bowmaking and the various materials involved, and roughly how bows are made. You'll all walk out of here today perfectly able to make a bow. So in terms of history, bowed string instruments go back, I'm not exactly sure, a few thousand years. They've been around for an awful long time, and they evolved and developed over the centuries. And the violin, I suppose, reached its the fullness of its evolution, I guess, in the 1600s, early 1700s. And then the bow was later, it was more like late 1700s. And it had been changing in shape up to the late 1700s. It changed enormously in shape in terms of the curve in the stick, which is a crucial element of how a bow works. They used to be curved the other way. Yeah. They were various. And then in the late 1700s, things started to get standardized, and then along came a guy called François-Xavier Tourte, who was a bowmaker in Paris, in France, and he basically pretty much standardized everything. Standardized the length, standardized incredibly crucial things such as the height of this 70 piece here is called the frog, the height of the frog, the height of the head. He changed the frog here is a closed-in thing. It used to be an open thing, a much more simple thing. He completely changed the architecture of the frog, standardized it in every way really. And since he was working, he stopped working coming towards the mid 1800s. The bow has not changed since then really. So he brought the bow. One guy brought him and his father and brother, mainly he brought the bow to the fullness of its evolution, and it hasn't really changed since. And then the materials, rather than start at one end and go to the other, we start right in the middle with this extraordinary wood, which is called Pernambuco, which comes from Brazil. Brazil actually takes its name, I only discovered this recently, Brazil takes its name from this very wood. And the wood takes its name now from the region wherein it grows. So it grows on the Atlantic coast of Brazil. The Portuguese, back in the day, used to call this wood pau-brasil, and that evolved into the name of Brazil for the country. And the wood gradually over time became known as Pernambuco, which is the main area in Brazil where this wood grows. And it used to be brought into Europe in the 15 and 16, 1700s for dye making. A few shavings of this stuff in a glass of water will turn the water pink, purple. And at a time when it was difficult to create the colour red, this produced orange, pink, yellow, red. And so a lot of, when you see paintings of, let's say, armies dressed in red coats, from that era, the chances are that all that cloth was dyed using Pernambuco. It's an extraordinary wood. And at some point in the 1700s, some bowmaker would have seen stacks of this stuff piled up along the Seine, I guess, and thought, well, this is going to be worth a try, and tried it, and lo and behold, it turned out to be the best thing anyone had ever come across for bowmaking. By the end of the 1700s, again, François-Xavier Tourte firmly established this wood as the wood, That's because of a combination of strength, flexibility, density, weight, the way it vibrates, the sound that it can create, and its ability to hold a curve. So when I make a bow, I'll start with a stick, straight stick, and with that, I'll put a curve into it from one end to the other. And that curve is so crucial. The slightest variation in that curve changes how the bow plays. Like I could change that curve microscopically, and a musician will immediately be able to tell that something has changed. It's very important. So the wood can hold that. You can create a shape with heat, bend it, and it'll hold that shape very well. And because it's an organic thing, and it will change with the pressures of playing and time, it can lose some of that curve, the camber we call it. It can twist along its length, it can bend to one side or the other. And one of the fantastic properties of this wood is that you can endlessly correct things. So I can go back with this or a little alcohol lamp, and I can, a bow that has got bent, I can straighten it. If it has twisted along its length, I can untwist it. If it has lost camber, I can heat it up and put the camber back in. And you can do that endlessly. So there's a lot of bows being used today that were made by Francois Xavier Tourt, for example, and people like him in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And those bows are still working more than well today. Indeed, the most sought after bows on the planet now would be bows made by Francois Xavier Tourt in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And if you wanted to buy one of them these days, you're looking at least 300 grand for one. At least. And there's an element of that's just crazy, you know. But there's a supply and demand problem there, you know. And not only was the work he did extraordinary, and what he managed to achieve in terms of coming up with a bow that perfectly suited the music that was being played at the time and since. His workmanship was also extraordinary. So the aesthetics of his bows were jaw-droppingly beautiful. You know, if you pick up a Tourt, you know pretty much straight away you're looking at a Francois Xavier Tourt bow, even though they're all different. He didn't standardize his model of bow. They're all different, but you know you're looking at a Tourt. There's just something ineffable, something extraordinary. That would be hard to describe why one of these bows is so beautiful, but they are beautiful, and they work extraordinarily well, and they produce sound on an instrument, excuse me, that not a lot of bows can produce. And that's an extraordinary thing in itself. I could make two bows cut perhaps from one plank, like a plank of Pernambuco like that. I could probably get 3 bows out of this. I could make them all more or less the same, but they'd all sound different on any given instrument. And there's an extraordinary variety of sound that you can get from one bow to another. If our tree was here, this board would have sat in the tree like this. So this piece of wood here is many years older, perhaps, than the piece of wood in here. So a bow taken from here could be quite different from a bow taken from in here. So even from the same plank, there's a lot of variety. So that's Pernambuco. I should say about Pernambuco, actually, it's such an important thing, really. Like if you take a performance like we heard downstairs this morning, there are the very obvious things that go to make up a performance like that. The musicians and the music, obviously, but in terms of materials, Pernambuco is one of the things that make a performance like that possible. Like nothing has been found since Pernambuco that can do what Pernambuco does and that can sound like Pernambuco sounds. So the wood in the instruments, like the maple, the spruce, and the Pernambuco are so important in being able to create a performance like what happened this morning. And it's a performance like that it's a work of art, really. And unlike a painting or something more tangible, it's once the performance is over, it's gone, and it exists in our memory and in perhaps in a collective consciousness. But it's a beautiful thing, and we're at a moment in the history of music, a very crucial moment in the history of music now. In November, CITES the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, is going to vote on whether to outlaw Pernambuco, the use of Pernambuco completely. And hopefully they won't, and I'm optimistic that they won't, but people should be aware of it, because it is a crucial moment in the history of classical music and other music. If they go ahead with this, it'll mean that, bowmakers will be out of business in terms of using Pernambuco. Musicians won't be able to travel without permits to prove that their bow was made from wood that it was made previous to 2007. So you can imagine a situation where you have an orchestra rocking up to an airport and they're touring, and out of all the players, 3 of them have forgotten their permits. They're either not going to travel, or their bows will be confiscated. So orchestras aren't going to travel. So this is going to, if this goes ahead, it's going to change the world of classical music. If not forever, then at least for a very long time until things change again. So that's just a little serious part of the talk. If you're curious about it, look up CITES and Pernambuco. And something that people could do if they were of a mind to, is to write to CITES, pushing the point about how important this wood is and how we all want it to be well conserved and looked after in the rainforests in Brazil, but we need to be able to use it, of course, sustainably. But it's so important to us, to the whole world of music. This wood is so important. Okay, that's the serious part aside, and we move on to some other materials. At the other end of the bow, you've got the frog, made of ebony. The ebony I use comes from Vietnam, Cambodian border area. I've cut off sections of that and split those sections into little pieces like that, and then that gets shaped and carved. Silver and shell are inlaid into it. It's a thing that comes apart so that the hair can be inserted inside, and then the frog is all closed up again. And it's another extraordinary material. Within that frog, then you have things like, you've got shell in a few places. You've got some mother of pearl shell on the base here, and on the sides of the frog, and on the end of the button. And that's, people use different kinds of abalone. You can come up at the end and have a look at all this stuff. That's abalone from Japan that I use, really beautiful stuff. There's an abalone from New Zealand, Paua, beautiful to eat, beautiful shell to look at. That's an abalone from Brittany that the old French bowmakers very standardly used. Sometimes frogs are not made out of Pernambuco, they're made out of ivory, or mammoth ivory. Elephant ivory is not in use, of course, anymore, thankfully. Mammoth ivory is in use. Tortoise shell, and another beautiful material. Thankfully, turtles, it's not tortoise, of course, it's called tortoise shell, but it comes from turtles. They are rightly protected. This is really old stuff. If you want to use stuff like that these days, it has to come from, you need a certificate with it to state that it came from before tortoise shell was outlawed. So it's used in a limited way these days. What else have we got? We have other animals represented. The leather here is usually, or the thumb piece here to protect the stick from thumb wear is usually made from some kind of leather. I use lizard skin. Then this lapping here, which protects the stick from the finger, is made from this stuff I use here. Has a core of silk wrapped around with a very, very, very fine silver wire. So the silkworm is another animal involved. What else? Yeah, those are the main materials in time. In terms of making a bow, the method I learned to make is a very traditional French method developed by the aforementioned François-Xavier Tourte and his compatriots. And it's a beautiful sequence of steps that all come together to produce a finished bow. And it's all handmade, it's all hand carved. It's things like chisels, knives, a variety of saws and pliers, etc., etc. A lot of these tools I've got here, I've found at flea markets in Paris. I found some fantastic tools there. So it's lovely to have, to work with tools that have a history when doing something that has such a history itself. So I enjoy that. Actually, while I think of it, going back to materials, one of the things I find extraordinary about this shell is that the sort of colours you'll get in here, you'll often see in the shell on the base of a frog. It can seem like you're looking at a picture of a landscape. It often looks like, even in the little pearl eyes on the side of the frog, I'll try to select a piece, I'll try to find a piece in a piece like this that looks like a sunset. So you can have, even in that tiny 7mm diameter piece of shell, you can have something that looks like hills with the sun going down behind it and the sea in the front, and you can get quite extraordinary effects. And of course the only other place you will get that sort of effect is in an actual sunset. So I get quite a kick out of the fact that the sort of colours, the actual colours themselves and the interaction of colours and the texture of them, the only places you'll find them are at the bottom of the sea and in the sky, and nowhere in between. And I just get a kick out of that. And some of the shell we use is they call it white abalone. It doesn't have colour, it just has very beautiful texture, whites and greys. And you can look out the window on a cloudy day and you can, with a variety of cloud in it, and it's again the same effect. So that's interesting. Then, where was I? Oh yeah, in terms of making a bow, so I'll start off with a plank, cut it into a stick like this, and then with these various hand tools, gradually shape it down into something closer to a bow form. I'll make that frog with ebony shell, silver. I'll make the button. The only bit of machinery we use in bow making really is for that button. I make that in a lathe. This thing is a core of ebony with silver bands put onto it, and then the whole thing hand filed, facets hand filed on it. But apart from the lathe, everything is done by hand. So the stick is formed with the knives, with the planes that I use, one enormous one and two sort of normal sized ones. And files are a very important part of bow making. And then you work on the stick, you work on the frog, you work on the button, and then you put all three together at the end. And hey presto, you've got a bow, and hopefully it works. Excuse me. And things like the dimensions. Like when I'm making a bow, I'll be keeping a very close eye on the measurements, like the height and the width of the stick, here and here and here, etc. The height of the head, the height of the stick behind the head, the shape of that 5mm area, let's say, behind the head is you can spend a lifetime studying that in itself. And all these tiny little details make such differences in terms of how a bow performs. And it'll be a little different for every stick. Every stick is not the same, so the dimensions of every bow won't necessarily be the same. So there's a lot of flexing the bow in your hands and thinking, okay, is that going to work? And moreover, is it going to work for the person I'm making it for? Because people want different things. The bow that one person wants won't necessarily work for another person. People want different things in terms of sound, weight, where the balance point of the bow is, flexibility, strength. Some people like a very flexible bow, some people like a stronger bow. There's a lot of variety. But hopefully once it's made and goes to its intended person, it works. I nearly forgot.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The last thing we do in making the bow, pretty much, is put the hair in.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost an afterthought, really. And the hair, of course, is so crucial, and it's extraordinary stuff in itself. The hair I use comes from Mongolia. Horsehair has been used in the bows of string instruments for God knows how long. And as with Pernambuco, nothing has been found to equal it or better it. So people are always trying to create a synthetic hair that will work as well as horsehair, and nobody's managed to do it. And of course, when I put hair on a bow, if I hand that to a musician, it doesn't work. If you try to play that, nothing happens. You have to put rosin on it from pine sap. So whoever discovered that you could take a piece of a tail of a horse and put pine sap on it and it would work on a musical instrument. Mind boggles, really. And it's another, like a lot of these materials, they're very precious, you know. Ebony, Pernambuco, silver. I use gold often, not often, occasionally. It's not something I encourage actually, but I love the aesthetic of ebony and silver. Sometimes people will ask for a gold mounted bow, so all the metal here will be gold. These are all precious materials, but so is the horsehair. This stuff, to get enough of this for one bow, I worked out with the guy who supplies me with horsehair. You need about 30 horses to go to slaughter to get enough hair for one bow. And the reason that an awful lot of the hair that bowmakers use comes from Mongolia is a question of supply. Because they use the horse. The horse is such a huge part of life in Mongolia as transport, as a work animal, as food. But they slaughter horses, which of course they invariably do in great numbers. Every single part of the animal gets used. Even the body hair is shaved and used sold around the world for small brushes and God knows what. But when you look at a horse's tail, you know, you see something that long, perhaps, but of course only some of it is that long. Most of it is shorter. You've got various lengths of hair in that tail. By the time you've got enough, when you take out the hairs that are long enough, you might get on average 10, and then of them, maybe 5 are going to be good enough quality. So you've got roughly 150, 160 hairs in a violin bow, more in a viola bow, more in a cello bow. You can see that you need the tails, you need hair from a lot of horses. So when I realised this, it suddenly for me, horsehair became a precious material in itself. The guy who does supply me, he's in his mid-70s now. He's been in the hair trade since he was a teenager, and he remembers when he was young, all the hair that bowmakers used came from Ireland and the UK. And of course, horses were used all the time, and now they're not. So there's a myth that has gone around for years in the music world. People will say very sagely that the Mongolian hair is best because it comes from I've said it myself to people. It comes from a cold climate, so the hair is sturdier, it's stronger, and it's absolute nonsense. It's just that they have lots of hair and we don't. So I think that's kind of it for materials and history and making. So how are we for time? We have to be out of here by 3. So questions.
Quick question. How did you learn all this?
I learned in Westport actually. Yeah. So I was working in a violin shop in New Zealand for years, repairing and restoring instruments and bows. And I came to Ireland on a visit in 2001, and I came to visit a bowmaker called Noel Burke, who lived outside Westport. And I was fascinated by what he was doing, and he offered to show me how to make a bow, so I moved back here a year later, intending to stay I moved back here in 2002, intending to stay for about 2 or 3 years. And I'm still here. Actually, just about now, 2022, it's 20 years since I started bowmaking. And that all started in Westport. The other bowmaker left since then. I stayed here.
Would you have to be a musician yourself to be able to do that?
You don't have to be. The guy who taught me is an absolutely brilliant bowmaker, and he's a flute player. I think it's useful. I mean, I play traditional music badly on the fiddle, and it's useful to be able to play, but it's not essential. You can tell an awful lot by just flexing that stick in your hand and having a certain amount of knowledge and experience and just the feel of the thing. So much of it is to do with feel. And actually, I forgot to say something earlier, that goes back to the method that I learned. In other countries, in England and Germany, there are great bowmaking traditions as well. The French were ahead of everybody, by the way. As discussed, Francois-Xavier Tourte standardized everything. All the bowmaking in other parts of the world came, evolved, or well, was influenced by him. It all started with him, really. But in other countries, they use a lot of machinery. In the French method, it's very much a hand craft. Everything is handmade, and that adds something as well, I think. I've lost my train of thought now. Where was I going with that?
Is it to do with the quality then? Like the fact that it's handmade, so are the French bows then more important?
Yes, French bows are seen as the most sought after bows, and that's not always fair. In other traditions, Germany and England notably, there's just extraordinary work. Every bit is good. But one of the things about that French tradition, and maybe the fact that there have never been bowmaking schools churning out loads of bowmakers every year, there aren't that many of us. And so it's not difficult to trace. I can trace back the lineage of teachers, from my teacher to his teacher and his teacher, right back to Francois-Xavier Tourte in the 1700s. And that's another thing I get a kick out of in bowmaking. And someone like Francois-Xavier Tourte, because it's such a, because everything is done by hand, and the method has been passed down, although perhaps varied over the years. I'm sure Tourte could step into my workshop and he might be surprised by the electricity, but he could sit down at the bench, and I'm sure it wouldn't take him long to figure out that everything would be there that he would need, you know. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
Have you ever tried snake wood?
I haven't, Ian. No.
I mean, I know it's used a lot in China, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Alternative.
And it's used in a lot of, when people make Baroque style, bowls, they do use other woods apart from Pernambuco.
Yeah.
The snake wood primarily among them, for sure. I haven't used it myself.
Because I just wonder, you know, I mean, like when I was in the business, you know, obviously classical players, we have to use staccato and spiccato and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But if you're doing like trad music, you don't need to be able to do things like the things that your bows can do.
Yeah, good point.
You don't actually need to be able to do them.
That's right.
So I'm just wondering if you could actually go for a cheaper material.
You
and,
could.
you know, a more abundant material, because
Yeah.
what you're doing is you're making a Rolls Royce, and a lot of people will be using, well, not, you know, a lot of people don't need a Rolls Royce. You know, they need a Micra.
Yeah.
You know, and a snake wood will give you a Micra.
It's a great point, actually. I'm glad you mentioned that, because going back to the Pernambuco problem that we're potentially facing in November, but hopefully not. One of the problems there is that you have factories in China producing student quality bows. They're mass produced. They're not of great quality, but they're made of Pernambuco. So there's a vast amount of, the whole reason this problem came up in Brazil is that there's a huge amount of Pernambuco being cut down illegally in Brazil and sent around the world. And China and other countries absorb a huge amount of this stuff, and it's really wasted.
It's
the same point you're making. It's not necessary to use Pernambuco for, let's say, for a lot of various kinds of folk music, or for student grade bows. It's not necessary. So that's the thing, that there's a lot of work being done in terms of people in the instrument world. It goes talking to CITES, with whom there's a good relationship actually. In CITES, they do, I think, kind of get the importance of this. But that's one of the areas that's being, one of the points that's being pushed at the moment, that we will try to take Pernambuco out of the mass-produced stuff
and just keep it for the really special.
Keep it for where it's really needed.
I don't know about ebony. Is ebony endangered? That's African, isn't it?
Ebony comes from Africa, India, Vietnam, Cambodia, various places.
Yeah.
Ebony from Madagascar was hugely prized for bowmaking, but you can't touch ebony from Madagascar.
No, I mean, you know, on the instruments, I understand, you know, obviously,
right.
I would know about the fingerboards and things, and you need the durability. I mean, ebony is incredible. I mean, I've played my
it's amazing.
I haven't had a new fingerboard for, sure, well, I've had my violin for 40 years. Now it's rotting now, he's short, but it's,
Yes.
You know, if you, so I understand that maybe ebony's a hard one to replace because of the,
Yeah.
you know, because it is so durable.
Yeah, that's right. It would be hard to beat ebony. Mind you, people are doing things these days in terms of compressing softer woods to create imitation hardwoods, and that can work quite well as a substitute for a fingerboard or something like
Because
that.
I mean, everything, the bows and the violins, we use things that were so taken for granted and now are so precious
Yeah,
that,
absolutely, yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
that it's,
And we need to be very conservation minded to
Yeah.
ensure the survival of these
Yeah.
things.
On these lines, I mean, also about the horsehair. If you say you need 30 for 30 horses for one bow, I mean, that's not very sustainable either. So has the serious point is, has one been trying to find another kind of alternative material?
Well, yeah, as I was saying a while ago, for ages people have been trying to produce a synthetic hair that will work as well as horsehair, and nothing has been found. But I'd argue that the horsehair thing is sustainable. Because in somewhere like Mongolia, they're slaughtering so many horses anyway. They're not doing it for the bow trade. You know, they're doing it for a multiplicity of reasons.
Would black horsehair work?
Absolutely, Carol. Yeah, good point. I use black horsehair mainly for double bass bowls. It tends to be coarser and stronger. So it's a bit coarse for violin, viola, and cello, but it's very good for double bass.
Gary, coming back to the wood, have they made any headway on sustainable forestry for Pernambuco?
Great question. There's a huge amount of work has gone on over the last 20-30 years in terms of replanting Pernambuco in Brazil. There's an organisation called the IPCI, the International Pernambuco Conservation Initiative, and they've done fantastic work with the Brazilian government in terms of replanting. They've done quite extraordinary work, and there's a very good relationship between the IPCI and CITES and people in Brazil.
And do you know what family the tree comes from?
The scientific name for most of what we use is Caesalpinia echinata. It's actually a member of the pea family,
Is it a fast grower?
you could try pea.
What is snakewood?
Snakewood is another tropical.
Nobody. Do you know what?
No, I don't.
No, the botanical.
Couldn't tell you.
No.
So the tree would only grow in tropical areas?
Yeah, before, I suppose going back to the, 13, 14, 1500s, there would have been a lot of European wood used, but bows were so much simpler. Even into the 1700s, there probably still would have been European fruit woods and other woods being used, but bows were so much simpler, there was so much less demand on them. What's demanded of bows in the last couple of centuries, that sort of demand wasn't on them in the past. And bows were often quite throwaway things, you know. They used to make bows in, say, the 1700s for almost specific pieces of music. This is something I only discovered recently. Bows were made, quite simple bows, were made in extraordinary quantities. And they were almost sort of throwaway items.
Does that tree grow fast or slowly?
It does grow relatively fast, even though it's a hard, dense wood. Within 30 years of being planted, you can harvest it for bowmaking.
How long does it take you to make a bow, roughly, from start to finish?
It takes me about a week and a half to 2 weeks. Yeah. It looks simple enough, and it is simple enough, but it's all those little bits take time. Nicola.
And how does somebody contact you if they're interested in ordering a bow? Do you have a website?
Google.
Google?
Google. You can, yeah.
Do you have a website or?
I do. Yeah. I have a very basic website that I don't look after. Somebody said to me once, having a website is like having a baby. You have to look after it. And I don't look after my website very well.
Well, can I ask you that when you're talking about different types of bows, that was really interesting about all the materials that are going to, that are under threat. But are you talking about classification of bows that exist from the earliest bows to the best of the current type, which could be classified, and then you could be known as a certain bowmaker of the class a certain type of classic bow, and then maybe it becomes over time uncool to have a bow with the wrong mix. It's like a new bow, which would actually people would know which class they're buying into.
Interesting idea.
Maybe that would be the easier way globally
Yeah.
to fix the classes to existing and
It's interesting. Yeah, we're going to have to look at all sorts of ways, I suppose, to persuade societies that we can use this wood sustainably, and that we do genuinely want this wood to flourish.
I think that the higher end of the market should be made clear to the organisation. So you see that there's certain
Yeah, that's happening. That's
Nice.
happening. Yeah,
Yes.
that is happening.
there's a group of
But like just on Nicola's point, like the interesting thing is you could also make the lower end of the market, like musicians, aware of this issue.
Yeah.
We could basically,
Mhm.
you know, oh God, no, we're not going to waste such resources on
Absolutely,
student
yeah.
bows, so
Yeah.
that there'd be an awareness amongst teachers and students
Yeah,
to seek bows that are
absolutely
linked to
good. Yeah, a lot of awareness and education needs to be created. There needs to be a lot of education in this area for sure. Definitely. Yeah.
Do you have a waiting list?
I do. Yeah. COVID reduced it a bit, but it would be it's a few years long, I suppose. But like any bowmaker who's you know who has some sort of an idea of what they're doing is going to have a waiting list, and it's back to that point of there are no schools for bowmaking. There are schools all over the world churning out thousands of violin makers every year, and they're all at each other's throats. They're all in competition. They're all vying for work and for jobs, and they really need to be culled at this point. You know, there's just too many of them. They're not an endangered species. You know?
Are there many?
They're almost a pest.
Are there many in Ireland?
Violin makers, there's probably about 14 or 15, and there's maybe 3 bowmakers. And I'd say you'd see that proportion represented in a lot of countries around the world, because if you want to learn bowmaking, you have to find someone who will teach you.
Do you take any apprentices? Do you ever have anybody like coming to knock
Yeah,
on
yeah.
your door saying, will you teach me how to make them?
Yeah, I do in recent years. Yeah, that's been a fantastic addition to my working life. I do quite a bit of teaching now,
Great.
and it's so satisfying to pass that on, to see people, you know, grab that particular bit between their teeth and run with it. It's marvelous. I taught one guy actually. Some of you might have come across the Castellian string quartet, one of the finest string quartets around today. They're absolutely extraordinary. And the guy who was a cellist with them until recently, I taught him bowmaking during COVID. He lives in London, and I taught him via WhatsApp video. And so I'm there with my phone, leaning up against something on my workbench, and I demonstrate a step, and he would go in and do that step and come back to me and show me what he's done on the camera. I thought, this won't work. And he said, can we give it a try? Because he was supposed to come in person and work with me. And I said, well, we'll try it, but look, don't be disappointed if it doesn't work, because it would be difficult to convey this and for you to learn it. And he just did it, no problem. Quite extraordinary. So yeah, I've been doing quite a bit of teaching, and it's marvellous, lovely thing to do.
Gary,
Sorry, Carol?
Tell about your nice American apprentice.
Oh yeah, Sawyer.
Yes.
Yeah, Sawyer, I taught a guy called Sawyer Thompson. Good point, Carol. Sawyer's a very interesting character. Sawyer is a guy he's an American bow dealer and expert. So he's a guy who, and I couldn't do this, and most of us bowmakers couldn't do this. He could pick up an old bow from, let's say, the late 1700s, early 1800s, and he could tell you not only who made it, but at what point in his career he was likely to have made it. Like, quite extraordinary. So he would spend a lot of time at auctions, buying and selling bows and dealing amongst musicians, and a guy who is he just lives and breathes bows. Like, he's an absolute, there are a lot of nerds in the instrument and bow world. This guy is an absolute fanatic.
I'll tell you a little story. Last year we were here, and there was 3 violins, and they heard Gary Leahy. The name Gary Leahy, and they went over and they were swooning. It was like meeting Elvis Presley in the 60s.
I think you exaggerate.
Oh no, that's it. No, yeah.
Right, yeah. Oh, thanks, yeah.
Yeah.
Tammy, can I ask you, when you start with the blank, when you're carving the blank, it's perfectly straight and bent at the end?
I meant to talk about that. It's perfectly straight and it's square.
So you work on it totally straight?
Initially, yeah. So I take a piece of wood like that, perfectly straight, and if it's not perfectly straight, when I've cut it out of the board, because it'll move once you take it out of the board, I'll make sure it's straight, and then I'll make it octagonal, and then I'll bring it down to a certain size. I'll rough it out, as we say, so I'll give it a very rough head shape. I'll make it octagonal. It'll be tapered from one end to the other.
And are you using a template or something, or are you just doing
No,
it by eye?
by eye.
With
And calipers. Yeah, by eye and calipers. And that's a good question actually to do with the how a bow is made. It's once I have that down to a roughed out shape, then I'll spend a lot of time heating it section by section and pushing that curve into it on the corner of the bench. And then I'll bring it down to its final dimensions. And one of the last things I'll do after carving the head and doing a lot of finishing work is from here to here, I'll either leave it octagonal or I'll make it round. And if I make it round, then it'll remain octagonal in here, and then between here and here it'll transition from octagonal to round. So that's a big difference you can see in violin, viola and cello bows. It could be a round shape, it could be an octagonal shape, and that has implications then for how it feels and how it works.
Gary, how do you manage wastage? I mean, if you take the piece that you have in front of you, right, with the little L end, okay,
yes. Mm-hmm.
and that's all one piece of wood.
Yeah.
Right. So are different bows of different lengths? In other words, that you don't end up. I mean, if you cannot get very many of those out of this because you're going to have a lot of wastage unless you are able to make bows of different lengths.
The violin bows and viola bows are the same length, 700 mil, and then a cello bow is bigger in every way but shorter. A violin bow and a viola bow are 730 mil, a cello bow is 700 mil. And there is an awful lot of waste. Like most of this is planed off, and it's a big pile of orange shavings on the floor. But I have various people who take that and use it for dyeing purposes. So all the stuff, anything that's left over, if I can possibly find another use for it, I do. And all my Pernambuco shavings are used. A guy in New Zealand uses it to make stain for violin making. There's a woman in Wicklow who makes these extraordinary paintings out of dyed grasses and pressed flowers and stuff like this. Beautiful stuff. She uses Pernambuco to dye that. And then June Burke here in Westport, who makes woolen clothes, who makes all her own dyes. She uses the Pernambuco shavings to get a variety of pink and red, etc. for her wood. So all the waste wood gets used. Yeah.
Gary, once the bow is made, what's the biggest threat to it once it's in use?
Its owner. You know, like if you want to really keep both safe and look after them, musicians are an absolute curse, you know? they just wreak havoc on these things we make. But they're fragile, but they're robust, so they can cope with a lot, you know. The biggest threat to a bow in terms of its safety, I suppose, is if somebody drops it. You'll see bows dropped that snap off the head.
Yeah, it's always the head that comes off.
Yeah,
I've seen that several times.
So I wrote an article for the trade magazine, the Strad magazine, recently, just about looking after. That's a great point, actually, Rosemary, because this article I wrote was about just basic stuff you can do to look after your bow and keep it safe, you know, and maintain it properly. And it's something that musicians don't know a lot about necessarily because nobody tells them. You know, they go through all this musical education and they're not told an awful lot about how to keep their gear in good condition and good working order.
I think the most dangerous thing is when people put them they leave them on the music stand.
Yes, or on a chair.
Basically, I've always done it. When you're not using it, it goes back in the case, and that's it.
Yeah.
I had a desk partner once, John Growler, who was very proud. He had just bought a tour, like you were talking about. He just bought a tour, and I wasn't on that show, but he put the bow on his knees and leant forward to turn the page. The bow went nose first into the ground. The tip was broken, and now you can pin the head, but it's, apart from anything else, there's an enormous financial difference between a turret with a pinned head and a turret without a pinned head.
Yeah.
It's a massive financial
Absolutely.
hit. Never mind the desperate taking a work apart and breaking it.
Yeah.
It's,
And that's so often what happens, is that it'll snap across the middle of the head.
But
the repair that you can do on that makes it stronger and better than ever, really. You can, for that repair, you glue the head back on, you take a circular saw and cut down into the head, and then put in a spline of Pernambuco with the grain going in the other direction to the wood in the stick, shape it all back in. It's visible, which is necessary because you don't want to fool anybody, but it's much more robust. You could argue that you should do it with every new bow in the process of making it. Put a spline in there, it'll be stronger than ever. Nothing has changed in terms of weight or playability, but as you say, it loses. We say in the trade that 90% of the value of the bow is gone. So if you have a tour to worth 300 or 400 grand, and 90% of that is gone, there's a problem.
Whenever they're playing, sometimes you see a hair, like, for example, the one this morning, there was a hair broken. It can obviously still be played, but at some point, if all the hairs get, they have to be replaced.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's part of routine maintenance of a bow. Hair gets replaced at least once a year. Some people will get their bow re-haired every few months. So like I did a bunch of re-hairs over the last few days for some of the musicians here. This hair wears out all the time, breaks, and just gets old.
Yeah, but how many hairs have to break where it's essential that it has to be re-haired?
Well, it's extraordinary what people will turn up with.
Yeah.
What was that, Catherine?
It depends on the musician. I mean, some
exactly.
play on a ridiculously small amount of hairs before they get a new reader, or they just aren't in the right place where they can get one and move one.
Yes.
Good rehair, because a bad hair is just not worth a waste of time.
Yeah.
So, but you can work away with half the bow hair, but no, it's not. It's going to take away from the sound.
Usually, I suppose, if someone is bringing a bow in for a rehair because of broken hair, they're probably, once a quarter of the hair is gone, probably, they're surely going to be going to somebody for a rehair at that point.
Okay.
And how long does it take for a bundle of horsehair from Mongolia to reach this part of the world?
That's a great question, Sean, and I don't have the answer to it. You've got me curious about that now, because I know it starts off in Mongolia, as we said. They don't seem to have the expertise there in terms of dressing it and grading it. So as far as I can tell, all the bow hair from Mongolia goes into China, where they do have the expertise to grade it and dress it. So it gets very, very well cleaned, as you can imagine, graded into all the different lengths. I mean, the bowmaking industry is only one destination for horsehair. It goes to all sorts of industries around the world. And then it'll go from China to the various suppliers, like the guy in Yorkshire who supplies me. How long that journey takes, I don't know. I do know that there have been instances of people carrying horsehair from Mongolia into China and being attacked and mugged for their hair. Hair is a valuable commodity there. A friend of mine, Eamon Little, who makes radio and TV documentaries, he did a lovely documentary on the materials involved in bowmaking. And the hair obviously features a lot in that. And he and I went to visit my supplier in Yorkshire to discuss hair and how it's treated and so on and so forth. But that was one question we didn't ask. How long does it take? I'm going to see if I can find that out. If I do, I'll get back to you. How are we doing for time? We have another few minutes if there's any questions.
I was just wondering what the function of the function of the quiddly bit at the end.
Great question. So, because I've put this curve into this stick, And I want the stick to hold that curve for forever and a day. So if a bow is under play tension, there's quite a bit of tension on that stick. So the person will do their practice, their performance, whatever. And then after that performance, by turning this, it's like it moves this frog along the stick and the hair goes slack. There's no tension on the stick. So all the time the bow is not being played, there is not tension on the stick. And it's a very simple mechanism. Let me just stand up to show you that. So you've got a hole weld right up through the stick here. You've got a mortise here. You've got another hole in here. You've got a bronze eyelet here that the screw goes into. It's such a simple thing. Tourt did this, or people around his time, but I think mainly him. Before that, they had a system of clipping a frog onto a stick. So you could pick different lengths, but you couldn't vary it really. And he came up with this simple thing. This, like so many things in a bow, a lot of these little ornate things, it's beauty concealing a function. So this is a very functional thing. So when that screw engages the bronze eyelet, and you move this, it pulls the frog along the stick. So that's what that's for.
Do we know why it's called frog?
I don't. It's extraordinary. Yes.
I know you mentioned how you got involved in bowmaking, but before that, did you say you were involved in repairing instruments, or
yes?
How did you get into that? I'm wondering how you started the process.
Well, I moved to New Zealand in 1996, and I was working as a tree surgeon out there, and I met a guy whose grandfather came from my part of West Cork, where I grew up. We used to play music together, and he was and is one of the finest violin makers on the planet, one of the best restorers I've ever seen. I remember seeing a violin that somebody had, coming on stage at a concert, had fallen down steps, and she brought her violin to this guy, John Hart, in a plastic bag in 100 pieces. It was just in bits. And when he was finished with it, you couldn't tell that anything had happened. You really couldn't tell. Like, it was absolutely extraordinary work. So I met John, and I was keen to come down out of the trees at some point and get my feet on safer ground. And John started teaching me repair work and setting up instruments. The setup of an instrument is so important. We could go on a whole tangent there, the height of the bridge, the diameter of the soundpost, the position of the soundpost, all this stuff. So he started teaching me this in the evenings, and then a guy came along who wanted to open a violin shop, and he employed John and I learned on the job at that shop. That's how that happened.
It's amazing that no European horses are used for horse sale, that you have to go all the way to Mongolia.
Is that problem with supply?
That's a good point. There's a lot of horses in Europe.
But not enough.
Yeah.
Not enough being slaughtered.
I've seen the herdsmen in Mongolia.
Have you?
Yeah, they move their animals to wherever the graze is available.
Right.
They move around.
Yeah.
And horses are towards villages all over the place.
Yeah.
And
were you on there, Sean?
Yeah, I've been there, yeah.
Right.
And they camp in these, what they call yurt, Y-U-R-T, yurts. And your first impression is that they're primitive. When you look around, you all have their laptops and their smartphones. Yeah. What do you call people who migrate from one part to another? Nomadic. Yeah, that's the word.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. I'll talk to you again about that. That's fascinating.
Have you ever attempted to go to Mongolia?
Oh, hugely. So the guy who made this radio documentary, he wants to make a film version, and he's trying to raise funding to do it. So if he does, that would involve visiting Mongolia, absolutely, visiting Brazil for the Pernambuco, visiting Alaska for the mammoth ivory. That's the thing actually I forgot to mention. Every bow has a bit of reinforcement here at the tip that's made of ebony and ivory, and these days mammoth ivory, and most of that comes from Alaska. I get it from a supplier in Ohio. And it would involve going to Japan for the shell.
What is mammoth?
What is mammoth?
What is mammoth ivory?
Mammoth ivory is the woolly mammoth, those animals with the enormous long tusks that have been extinct for 10,000 years.
And where do you get that?
So it's purely a finite source. I mean,
It's a finite source, but there's an awful lot of it, and it's perfectly legal. In most places, it's perfectly legal to trade in mammoth ivory.
Okay.
You can't trade in elephant ivory, but this stuff is legal.
Okay.
It's slightly problematic now because very few custom agents can tell the difference. So in some states in America, they've outlawed this stuff as well, purely because
they can't
who's going to be able to tell the difference unless they have a little bit of information, which they generally won't have.
Okay.
But do they have to, they don't have to kill the animal to get the tusk?
No, they've been extinct for 10,000 years. They're long gone.
They just lost out of
These woolly elephants with big long tusks.
Would they reintroduce them somewhere like Greenland or?
Weren't they talking about that? Yeah.
I've heard something about this.
Using DNA to recreate. Yeah. I'm reliably informed that in the National Museum in Ireland there is some mammoth tusk, Irish mammoth tusk.
Really?
And I always thought, well, you know, it's preserved in places like Alaska. It comes out of frozen ground generally. So I thought, of course, you know, maybe we never had mammoth in this country. And if we did, it would have probably all rotted away because, you know, it wasn't stored in frozen ground. But apparently it has been found in caves, and there is some in the National Museum.
Were they preserved in bogs, big bogs?
I haven't heard of that. You'd imagine that could be a possibility for sure.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard of it. But from some stuff exists from caves, apparently. This is really, really old. Like this is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. So every piece of ivory that I use, like it's another material that blows me away. That's potentially 10, 12, 15,000 years old. This every piece of it. If you want to come up and have a look at any of this stuff too, by the way. I suppose we're going to have to wrap it up because there's a concert starting at 3:30.